One basic question which underpins the activity of every philosopher was once formulated in the following way: how then shall we live? Just as it arose for Aristotle, so this question arises for us, whether we fancy ourselves philosophers or not. For it is not philosophy which poses the question, but life itself. The stuff of our lives is what prompts the question, and what follows from there is philosophy. This is a question which demands an answer, and so it is here that the need for philosophy emerges. If we were always sure of the right thing to do, which is to say nothing of actually doing it, the need for such inquiry would never arise. Whenever we are faced with an ethical dilemma, some junction at which we are divided between two or more responses to the question of how to live, we likely feel a corresponding emotion, perhaps accompanied by some physical sensation as well. Our minds enter into a state which is quite different from ordinary thinking, in which the facts of the world are more or less laid out in plain, and in which our course of action is basically clear. What precisely we are feeling, physically and mentally, under such a state, can perhaps best be labeled tension. Tension occurs whenever something is pulling in opposite directions. This of course presupposes that either direction is possible for something in tension to follow, and at the same time, that the force with which one is pulled in either way is equally or nearly equally matched between the two opposing ends. The capacity to take one direction or another, when presented with two or more options, is something which presupposes the notion of an ethical dilemma. And as it turns out, this capacity is something present in you and me. It could be the conflict between two sides within us, such as good or bad, or it could be something more complex, the id, ego, and superego, for example. But however we may like to express it, this experience of conflict or tension presupposes something of great value. For in order for there to be an experience of conflict or tension, there must first be something which is conflicted, something which is held in tension. And that something is you. You are, in this way, the most basic, primary presupposition of all philosophy. If this were not so, then our preliminary question, how shall we live, would never arise. But of course it does arise. What is more, there would be no one to act. Not only does the activity of philosophy require a mind by which it can be carried out, this carrying out itself seems to imply that there is something or someone for which the products of philosophical inquiry would be relevant, perhaps even enacted by. That something, again, is you. Where then does philosophy come from, except from us? And where else does it aim, except back to us? It issues from and leads back to us again and again as we interact with one another, with the world, and with certain objective aspects of our own selves. There is a tendency to think of philosophy as something that envelops or looms over us, or else it is thought to be something one can and ought to acquire or collect. In fact, it is neither. Instead, philosophy is more like a rope, something that connects people to one another, something that connects each of us to the world we inhabit. Philosophical inquiry is catalyzed in the same way that energy is shifted between two sides in a tug of war. It is precisely in this mode of thinking that we seek to restore balance, if only for a moment. Thus, trying to separate a human mind from philosophical inquiry is equivalent to separating the wetness from water. It is something we are part of, and it is just as much a part of us. Remember, a tug of war requires both parties' participation, and in this peculiar mode of inquiry, which arises from the stuff of our own lives, we cannot help but participate. We cannot help but engage, at least some of the time, in philosophy. So, when we do, why not enjoy it? After all, a tug of war is supposed to be something fun, even if you end up being the one who gets wet. So then, to return to our preliminary question, how shall we live? When I first began to study philosophy, I presumed that it was philosophy itself which would answer the question of how to live, what to think, what to do. I no longer believe this to be the case. This initial supposition was akin to mistaking someone's finger for something signified by their pointing, as in the famous example given by the Buddha. That is to say, I now take philosophy to be like the finger pointing out the moon, rather than the moon itself. I was told several years ago that philosophy aims to teach us how to think, not what to think. That the task of philosophers is to provide the questions, not necessarily the answers. And that sometimes an answer eludes us precisely because we haven't yet found the right question. And that any answer worth finding will ultimately be found not in mere contemplation, but in the world, in action. When I was a boy, a schoolmate offered to teach me how to dive. After explaining to me the proper stance, how to crouch, how to leap, I was still reluctant to actually follow through. Even though she had armed me with every requisite piece of information, and even after demonstrating once or twice herself precisely what I was supposed to do, I was afraid. To take that step beyond the familiar and the formulaic, to take leave of the comfort I found in mere conceptualization, was something I simply found too daunting, and so I remained in position, but went no further of my own accord. So she pushed me. She came up from behind me and pushed me in, and I dove. What I failed to realize was that there was only so much that preparation can accomplish. As Epictetus once advised, if you would wrestle, expect to get sand in your face. He may have just as well said, if you're going to dive, expect to get wet. But the point is that fear need not be absent in order to take a new course of action. In fact, it may be far more rational to expect to feel afraid than to suppose that something new will come easily and without any trepidation. I've come to think of fear as something I should become intimately acquainted with, rather than something I should push away. Paradoxically, it is only through increasing my intimacy with fear that it loses some of its pull. This is something that can be learned about in books, many books in fact, but it can have no benefit except through practical application. I was once told by a teacher of mine that in order to learn a life lesson, sometimes we need to have a life experience. Often I find that the answers to life's biggest questions do not have a page number attached to them, and that often the answers are found not merely in adherence to structure and form, but that they only follow that leap across this blank space, where no structure has been carved out, and no form has yet been found. At this juncture in my study of philosophy, I have not yet found the answers to many of the questions I had at the start. But I am not afraid of getting wet, and I am far less afraid of the blank space between the familiar and the unknown. After all, what good is knowing how to dive if you never leave the board?